So we're going to roll right into the next section and deal with that question we got earlier. James, you need to flip on your video and your audio back on. We're going to tackle that next topic around advanced work packaging, lean, and project production management. And we're going to, these things all work together, or are they in conflict or whatever? So we got some slides if you want to open that up, James.
Okay.
We're going to use to guide our conversation here, and then I'm sure we'll have a very interesting Q&A at the end here. So not that long ago, the Construction Users Roundtable occurred in its 2019 Voice magazine identified lean, advanced work packaging, and project production management as the three main modern production methods that are steering the conversation towards efficiency and effectiveness, not just productivity. So we often get asked, next slide, what are the differences between advanced work packaging, lean construction, project production management by many organizations that are either adopting or utilizing one or more of those approaches quite often simultaneously, as you saw from Petronas this morning. So let's get started. We've assembled a wonderful panel here who are very deep in all this. And if you've got any questions on your mind, these are the right folks to talk with. So let's start with Fernando España. He's the president of ConstructX, providing clients with advanced work packaging, implementation, education, and training solutions that combine the core concepts in lean, integrated project delivery, and governance structures and production planning and control for construction. Fernando spearheads ConstructX partnerships with industry and technology leaders to ensure customers attain leading edge solutions and competitive advantage. He'll be representing the AWP packaging perspective today. Next is John Strickland. John is a pioneer in bringing innovative thinking to engineering, procurement, and construction industry with a passion for workplace safety, learning, innovation, and creating smooth flow based on lean project delivery principles. His track record as a senior construction manager includes a series of breakthrough projects in the areas of safety, cost, schedule, and team satisfaction, made possible by the focus on flow and integration. He's been a part of LCI since its founding and introduced lean integrated project delivery thinking to countless teams, and has been a key resource for several clients as they transform their project delivery organizations to follow the lean IPD model. No surprise, today he'll be bringing his lean expertise to the discussion. Finally, James Chu, who doesn't need much of an introduction now. If you've been tuned in today, James is an active member of PPI's technical committee, developing and bringing leading edge thinking to the industry. Although clearly in this, he's involved in representing the PPM and operations science perspective. You should know he's been involved in R&D and implementation of lean construction since like 1997, and was the main author of a paper that was referenced in the COAA's 2013 construction work packaging best practice guidelines. So he's got a good history to pull on as well. So before we dive into how these methods may work together, we're going to ask the panel to describe which each one is. So we're going to start with Fernando.
All right. Thank you, Gary. All right. So for those of you that are not aware of what advanced work packaging is, there's goes back a ways. And as was alluded to, the fact that James's paper was referenced in this document, which is RT 272, it actually goes back to the early lean construction days, where a lot of the founders that shaped advanced work packaging and lean were working actually in conjunction with each other. But it is this overall process of looking at detailed work packages and CWPs, construction work packages, engineering work packages, and installation work packages, and getting to a final level of granularity so people can execute work more effectively and actually understand what the work is they're going to do well in advance. It is a planned, executable process that encompasses the work on engineering, procurement, and construction, EPCs. That's really where it's got its start and it gained its traction, which 272 did report in 2013, and really how it continues and how it really transforms programs, from initial planning all the way through the final completion. And it is a framework, and there is a lot that's going on. This is one of the early documents in 2013. It was followed up by RT 319. If you're familiar with Construction Industry Institute documents, which declared AWP as a best practice, and those are all available to those of you that belong to CII or need some reference. You can always reach out to one of us to get something like that to you. So there is a body of knowledge attached to it, and that body of knowledge, like everything else in this world, goes through continual improvement and updates. So if you want to go to the next slide. So it has matured, and what we're now looking at here is a better definition of what advanced work packaging is really trying to do, and its more holistic life cycle approach, right, going from early concepts all the way through operating facilities and how advanced work packaging contributes to all that. So as you can see on the left side, there's a blue and a yellow, what we call surfboard. That's what the industry now calls it. That basically started out as what work packaging was at the time, taking it from front-end planning to detailed engineering through construction. And now the importance of course, overall programs which say we got to get into completions and align that, and then use advanced work packaging in the operating facility and with all sorts of renovations and retrofits and turnarounds that happen in all sorts of facilities. So it's becoming more recognized as a project framework, and it is always looking to divide this project scope into manageable portions of work for planning and execution, which is critical. And the outcomes, what we're trying to achieve, at first it was the main focus was improving productivity, but right now we're looking at it as an outcome of improving productivity and increased predictability. And one thing that we've been recognizing over the last several years is this incorporation of agile and lean construction methodologies in that. And since 2019, essentially, recognition that the digitalization of our projects and the amount of data that's available really needs to embrace these automation technologies, which has been in existence for about 20 years as well, to different degrees. But right now, we're trying to leverage data as much as we can. It's been a big focus on CII for the last several years, like I mentioned. So why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll briefly describe what the overall framework looks like. There's the concept that's been driven since about 2016, 2017 by keeping the end in mind when we moved from strictly work-based planning out in the field. Hey, here's what the engineering procurement folks gave you, and go build this, right? And trying to make sense of all that. So beginning with the end in mind says, hey, we're in the upper right corner there, we're looking at the systems themselves. Hey, what are we trying to build? How do we really want to start it up? What's the desired outcomes at the end of the day? And that starts helping us shape what will become construction work areas, which are broad, multi-discipline geographical areas. If you look in a plot plan, it's pretty much where most everybody can identify the areas of a project, the logical areas of a project, and even understand the basic sequencing of those areas that align with the system startup. From there, the idea is to move from construction work areas in the top center down to the middle there, construction work packages, by getting all the disciplines to identify within these work areas their specific scopes of work, and breaking those scopes of work into logical sequences themselves, right? So they become very defined geographical spaces. They have the ability to be sequenced. They have the ability to be integrated. But to really get that and to look at the alignment between engineering and procurement, it's not a construction dictates what it's going to be. There's a process where, hey, if we're going to define these construction work packages, which has a specific scope of work, which may be somewhere between 10 to 15,000 hours of work, we need to get the engineering deliverables and the procurement deliverables. So let's define what we call work packages around that says deliver this engineering. And it starts allowing the conversations to take place between engineering and procurement to understand how things really get delivered, right? To understand, hey, I'm sorry, but that construction sequence you work, I can't deliver that from an engineering perspective because I've got to design systems around. So there's this cycle of alignment and integration that happens. And to get to a point where with construction work packages, which are generally level 3 schedule packages, we come out with a path of construction. And in that path of construction, we can get an aligned path of engineering. So this is how engineers really work, and this is how we're going to align and prioritize the deliverables to your construction work packages. So then we get a procurement alignment on how they want to deliver things and how materials can get assigned, and we can track feasibility, do feasibility analysis against those work packages. So once we have those construction work packages, which again are discipline-specific components of work, we'll take them and start dividing them into more discrete, smaller installation work packages, where a foreman, and one of the basic concepts is the foreman can understand the work they're going to go do in the next week or so, and they can go do that uninterrupted because all constraints have been removed, right? That's the key message here. So as we move from construction work packages to installation work packages, we put a shield in there that says we don't want to release that to the field, installation work packages, until all the engineering and procurement constraints, all the site constraints, everything that we can tell from within our control at the construction work package level has been cleared or satisfied. And that drops down, of course. Now we have an installation work package, which has dedicated workplace planners that work with the field, work with foremen, general foreman, construction, to understand the real constraints of getting the work done and break the work into smaller sequences of work, generally within, say, a week or two. The hours may be 200 hours, maybe 1,000 hours, 1,500 hours or more. But it's something that we can now remove every constraint from a workplace planning perspective and just leave those field level constraints, which a general foreman can go do, and then go execute that. We can sequence that work. We can integrate that work because they're small enough chunks. Think of a Lego block or an IKEA thing, right? We can just build it, and then the next thing gets attached. So we can identify prerequisite work. We can look at successor work and match those two. And all that, as the installation work packages come together, we move back into systems. So installation work packages all contribute to a system, whether it's in one CWP or other CWPs, construction work packages. And we can see how we're going to start the systems up as those are completed, because now with data, we can visualize and look at the readiness. So all these shields start taking place, that we don't start installation until all those constraints can be released. And then, of course, we go finish the work, we collect the work, we close out the work, and get into mechanical completions, so we can get to turnover and then turnover into operations. So there's this logic that happens in this advanced work packaging framework. So that's the high level overview around advanced work packaging, and I'm sure we'll have some questions later on. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Gary.
Very good. That was very insightful. And now we're going to talk about lean construction. And John, you're going to lead that.
There. Well, this is kind of fun to be on a panel or forum, and I'm recognizing people I've known for 20 years or more, talking about things that are very familiar. But lean construction, lean in general, is primarily a way of thinking. You'll see here the definition from LCI that's based on culture and respect. And you're noticing the graphic on the right, which are the big ideas. And we talk a lot about the generation of value. We focus on making sure we're delivering value to the customer, have everyone focused on that, and always getting a little bit better at that. And there's a lot of focus on removing waste. As time goes on, I think it's pretty important in this conversation is that my realization is it's not really about removing waste. It's about creating flow. That when you create flow, you intrinsically eliminate waste. But if you try to eliminate waste without creating flow, you can just kind of spin your wheels and make the piles of WIP between the stations bigger. That's what I think a lot of people do. So the idea of lean is also tremendously, I think part of it that gets missed even in the people who are practicing lean construction is that giant circle in the middle. And that's respect for people. And I think if you think about that is not just the altruistic, we're going to be nice and have everyone have a nice day. It's really more, I think, a respect for how people work together. So as production physics is the physics of how things get done, there needs to be the scientific understanding of how people get together to do them. And I think that's a big frontier for us to go do that. And the other aspect that is very big in the lean construction world is this concept of integrated project delivery. We heard all about it in the last presentation. Why do we have these major barriers? And what has happened is the commercial structures of a lot of projects have created these enormous barriers to the flow of information and work in the form of these giant procurement packages that don't flow together. And the short metaphor that occurred to me this morning is much like the rivers of the West have massive dams that keep the salmon and fish from migrating upstream. Well, our project delivery systems have erected these enormous barriers that we need to rethink. And people are very reluctant to tear down the dams, and people are very reluctant to tear down their contract structures. So this whole concept of lean is making sure everybody really understands what's really going on, about what's really important, and creating flow of value to the customer. And so I saw Fernando's slides, and I say, this is just the next level. He's gone through an evolution of AWP. There's just the next step we're going to keep going through. I think it's going to borrow heavily from some of the lean concepts. How is that for an overview of lean thinking?
It sounded pretty good. James, you want to tell us about PPM?
Sure. Okay, so what is PPM? So this is the definition that's in the PPI glossary. So PPM is the development and application of modern production theories, principles, and methods to better understand, control, and improve project delivery. This includes the application of operations science, digital, and autonomous technologies. So the digital and autonomous technologies is something that we're going to be talking about later in the future of construction. But the other element is something that we're going to touch up on now to give you a little bit of overview of what PPM is. So if you look at PPM definition, we talked about the application of production theory. The word production is the core element in which is the basis for our understanding. Any piece of pipe, equipment, foundation, piece of steel, or anything that gets installed on site, even a module as a whole, is going to go through a process of design. It's going to actually get made in a factory or some fabricator. It's going to get transported through vehicles, aircraft, and ships, and it's going to be installed. And these are moving through this system. That's the production system. How fast this work can be done, how fast these things actually move through the system is based on the capacity that's actually within the designers, engineers, factory fabricators, vehicles, aircraft, and ships, and construction labor and equipment. Okay. So things moving through the operation with those actually governed by the speed governed by the amount of capacity that's in the system. At the same time, work may actually get done and wait before it can be consumed by next, or you might actually have not enough of this, which actually will make this capacity here idle. Okay, so it's actually looking at everything actually as a system, as a production system, and designing and controlling it. So what is the framework that's being applied in understanding the production system? We call this the 4-5-3, 4 verbs. The areas of our focus is how we design things, how we make things, how we transport things, and how we build things, okay? So there is additional elements of project management, which is actually focused on the administrative side. That's not the main emphasis actually of PPM. The main emphasis of PPM is the actual production, which are these 4 verbs. Our underlying framework is that the cost and cash meaning the amount of money that's tied up before it actually creates a revenue, is a function of what we're making, the product design, okay, how we're making it, the actual process design, capacity, labor, and equipment that does the work, inventory, accounting for all the work that's waiting to be worked on, as well as work that's being worked on. Work that's actually waiting to be worked on is called stocks, and the industry is very familiar with stocks of material, stocks of information, and the work being worked on is WIP, work in process. And last but not least is the variability. How much variability you have in the system will dictate how much extra capacity you need or how much extra inventory you will actually need. And if you don't actually have extra capacity or inventory to deal with variability, what are the consequences of that to the overall time? Okay, so that is the 5 levers. What's interesting is these actually are not individually moving parts. As you make changes to one, the other one actually either changes, or if you don't change it, you'll actually have huge implications on cost, time, and cash. What's important is that these are not something that you actually have to try and error to find out what the relationship is, or you actually need huge amount of data, applying data science to figure out what the relationship is. There is already a fundamentally proven science that governs the behavior of these 5 levers. And that's what we call the operation science. And the 3 curves below it actually represent those. Okay? So that is the fundamental of PPM.
Okay, it's good. You mentioned there's an idea that thread all 3 approaches together. So why don't you continue on and tell us about that?
Yeah. So I think Fernando and John, which I think John alluded to, that we've been actually working together for the last 20 years, and there's some elements actually of lean, AWP, and so forth. There is actually a shared perspective. So, you know, people actually have said we're going to actually do AWP, but not lean, we're not PPM, and so forth. But there is actually a shared perspective. And what we wanted to actually to talk a little bit about is this concept. So this is something that I think many of you are familiar with. And if you're not familiar with, it's actually very easy to understand. So in the middle is an operation or task, something that you need to perform, whether it's actually be engineering, whether it's actually to deliver something, to transport, whether you're going to actually install something or you're going to actually make something. Left side is everything that you need in order to do the work. Okay, you need the preceding operation, whatever it might be, you need to complete it. You need the material, you need the information. In order to do the work, you need the capacity, which is driven by your equipment, labor, and space on the bottom. And on the top is the actual policies and the objectives and requirements that govern what does a good work of that operation look like, which will all result in the completion of an operation. If you don't have any of these available, then the operation cannot begin, or it may begin, but result in rework, or it may begin and actually work in a work stoppage. Okay, I think that's very, very easy to actually understand and relate to. Okay, now work phase, as Fernando pointed out, advanced work packaging had its foundations in work phase planning. Work phase planning, I think he actually used the word unconstrained, was to actually make sure that the work that's actually going to be done by the field was unconstrained. And this was the 2007 document that relates to work phase planning. Having a dedicated planner, an actual field installation work package that actually has all these components included in there to say, and you see the wall there that says, if you actually don't have any of these, don't release the work. Okay, that's actually promoting efficient use of available resource by organizing and delivering all necessary elements before the work is started. Okay. If you go to lean construction in the early days, a lot of focus actually, and still is on last planner concept. And last planner concept actually is the system for project production that promotes creation of predictable workflow. And one of the very, very fundamental aspect that actually we saw in 1998 paper, shielding production, says we're going to actually put a shield before the work actually gets done so that the labor can be protected from variability upstream. Again, the concept of a shield, either through an inventory buffer of using an inventory buffer of work. Okay. And this is actually from a PPM perspective. We actually look at everything as a production system. Okay, so you actually have supply flow that's actually going to have inventory of work, that's actually inventory of stuff that's actually being delivered, ready for installation, as well as the stuff that's actually been installed that will become a fundamental, the preceding operation that requires you to actually perform the subsequent activity. Okay, so this concept of making sure you actually have the stuff ready to protect the installation crew from being able to actually to promote the efficient use of their capacity is actually very common across the three themes. Okay, and using some form of inventory buffer to actually do that is all common. I think one of the biggest discussions that we actually been having across the three different approaches was how should those packages be, or how big should those inventory actually be? Okay, so the question is, the more you actually have there, the longer it's going to sit there, therefore longer the cycle time, which means more cash is going to tie it up. The bigger the batch, you're going to actually end up in the same result. Okay, so I think that where there is the common element, there is actually a little bit of science that actually needs to come together, or methodology or approach, however you want to actually call it, that needs to come together to actually help people define what these actually should be. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to actually turn it over to John and Fernando to talk about some of the approaches that's coming forward in actually trying to address that issue.
Yeah, I'll add to that, because what you just went through is there is that commonality of how do we make reliable work happen. And from an advanced work packaging perspective, for instance, we started saying we got to shield some work at the CWP level, and there's this transition that every project goes through from engineering into construction at different levels. So how do we mature a group that's involved with a project? And there's a set of releases that happen at the advanced work at the CWP level, a set of releases that happens at the installation worker level. And I think what's been missing at least from my perspective, is because I've worked in, as you know, James, in lean and operation science with you for, well, going back a few decades. But the fact is, what was missing was a last planner type perspective. And when you're exposed to all this and you learn to see things, right? We saw the opportunity because there was this say, well, hey, that's advanced work package, doesn't apply over here. We don't use it. They don't use it. We don't like lean. We don't, right? Just because we get comfortable, and goes back to what John said earlier, in contracts, hey, we get so used to it, it's very, very difficult to change. So in a couple of years ago, we just, because we've had this exposure, we wanted to bring this AWP plus lean thinking together, right? And we wanted to include, all the different types of methodologies that we should be exposing anybody that's interested to, right? We wanted to create this safe space to explore these different methodologies and raise awareness and benefits and use cases. And so people can make their own choices, say, hey, I understand what advanced work packaging is. I understand the benefits of lean. I understand the needs for operation science, and start the conversation happening, right? So, what you're showing here are several papers to that extent. What we're trying to achieve, that Better Together was our first attempt, and co-written by those in across ADP and lean and DFMA at the time. Was looking at, hey, here's the descriptions of each, here's the commonality, here's how they're complementary, and let's explore deeper. On the organization culture paper, which is, these are all now CII documents that we've introduced to the broader group, is looking at what generated actually was the lean construction, culture of respect, and say, well, how do we bring that kind of culture, the integrated type approach to things, and getting people to have different languages that are more focused on a project holistically. And and how do we gain that? You're right. I've seen it in lean, I've seen it on big projects, and I've seen even where all these, you kind of sort of develop a culture, but how do we really focus on that as being a key enabler? And then of course now we're really focused on really looking at the detailed differences and the comparison of approaches and introducing the concept of, John and I are working on this last one here on project workflow, looking at the different concepts of flow, which you just showed in your previous slide. How do we get people thinking that way? So I'll pause there because I know John's probably got a lot more to add too. So John, what you got? Anything more to?
No, it's just the realization that it started out. I think it might have started out the conversation that Fernando and I had at the CURT conference. We were talking about the apparent friction between AWP and lean and things, and says, there's ways to bring this together, and I think the work structuring is part of it. I think that we'll all blend and learn from each other, but I think that there is a great ability to move forward. And I think we have a slide coming up in a minute that kind of talks about how we bring these folks together. And you might talk about AWP, but that's what I was talking about here. We're calling it next gen delivery thinking, and you can see that we started this out. I was kind of representing the lean perspective. There's a bunch of people on this call who could probably do that even better than I could, who were there when this all started, and AWP. And we held a symposium very early on, or a virtual event over a year ago. And kind of a key part to me was when Jamie Gerbeck, who's now the executive or the interim director of CII, was talking about culture in an AWP concept, in AWP framework. And I said, that sounds exactly what I would hear at an LCI event, exactly the same culture. So that was kind of a common point that got me thinking there's actually quite a lot here. And it turns out that we had another event, and we had CURT. So we actually had the executive directors of LCI, CURT, and CII together saying, hey, you guys are on to something, let's go pursue this. And at that, I said, I think we need to reach out to PPI and PPM. So that's kind of where we are here. And the outcome is we're going to kind of learn from each other and develop future leaders. I'm not sure I'm wanting to create another toolkit, but I'm wanting to create an awareness of how things work and what's really going on to kind of steer the future delivery. You guys want to add on to that?
Well, here's probably a good point to say, that to get to this next gen type thinking, and this is not like saying, hey, we're going to develop something completely new. It's really how do we look at what's the best practices out there and blend those into something that each organization can leverage themselves. Hey, I can pull from here. Whether I'm in a hospital project, I can use a little bit of AWP, a lot of lean, and some operation science versus a big oil and gas or process doing the same thing. We need to pull a little bit more out of AWP, but we need to start looking at operation science. We need to start looking at last planner, because those are gaps, and we've seen that, and that's kind of what drove all this. Is that, hey, AWP, in fact, there was a slide before. Hey, AWP is good today, but not good enough, right? That's kind of the theme going in, is why isn't it good enough? And if we each look down deep into the methodologies that we practice, we'll say, hey, this is great in theory and good in practice, but my gosh, we still have a long way to go. And in AWP, it was 2019, we introduced just a capability matrix, saying, here's what this means to do AWP. And everybody looked and say, wow, I didn't realize that. And we want to do the same thing with lean. What maybe we're working with John is that this is what lean really does, and how we take it from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, because it is a journey. We can only move at the speed of the industry or the customer or the specific organization, and those are things to look at. And so developing these memorandum of understanding between these organizations seems like a great first step. And I think even David Care's on the line, but kind of drove that line of thinking. Yeah, it's a lot of opportunity here. And those of us that have been in this business, and we're always learning to see, right? Hey, this is something new, and I don't ever want to consider myself the expert. People will call me that, but I'm learning all the time, and I want to learn from my friends at PPI. I want to learn from my friends at Lean Construction, because the application to the project that we're involved with now is just huge, and we know we can drive more value. But hey, we're just on a little bit of a journey, and one step. Let's introduce this little part and see how it works.
Also, the common problem we have is really lousy we have lousy project results and terrible project experiences. I think Gary alluded to it in his opening remarks. We can't get people to join the industry because only an idiot would do that. If you really understood what we did, and so that's why we're all here. But but we need to pull together to go change this, and there's a big tipping point. And so we're going to be a lot more effective if we're working in concert to go attack this thing. And so we make sure we're not kind of bickering among ourselves. Like the other metaphor I kind of like, back to the natural metaphors, is it's sort of like a pack of wolves. No individual wolf is going to take down the elk. Working together, they can make some progress, and I think that's what we need to do. We have much more in common. And my personal experience is, this is where I met Fernando and James 20 years ago. We're on a very large, very complex technology project. I was program manager, but we incorporated lean construction and what became the PPI concepts. And I never sensed there was any conflict between those ideas at all. They seemed completely compatible to me then, and they still do now. So let's keep
that's a very good point, John, that we all have a common enemy. That's project performance.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting to note that all these three methods have the same root.
Yeah.
Trying to address that issue. And there's a lot of normalized pain in our industry where we just accept things the way they are. Well, that's just the way it is. We have contracts and we got to live with it. And we've got to fundamentally change those things. But go to the next slide. I'd like to tease out from each one of you what you see from your vantage point coming into this conversation from AWP, Lean, and PPM, contributing to the next generation of project delivery. What are the positive things that we need to bring into this aligned concept? Describe it that way.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's kind of why we opened up the joint working group at CII to any member. And you don't have to be a member of CII to join, because one of the biggest things that we're trying to contribute is from an ADP perspective. We want to learn. We need to learn what's out there, because that's one of the biggest things. Is a lot of folks are I don't want to say ignorant, that's a strong word, but are unaware of what other best practices exist. Yes, hey, we can rest on the laurels that there's all these improvements you're getting, these benefits you're getting, but the fact is, if you're in a bad process and you do anything, you're going to get some improvement, and that's been proven. So I think what the contribution is, and what I've heard most, is from advanced work packaging. It provides a structure that we can all agree to, and one of the key concepts from what I've learned in Lean is that we can define things, right? And we can define the work packages and logical work packages, and then we can allow agile processes in there to enable change management and all these things, right? Open up these conversations. I believe, and I'll just start that as the first one, is it's bringing a structure and a very, very strong, in that structure, a very, very strong constraint management process to help the next gen project delivery. And what we need now, is to be able to absorb, by bringing that awareness and understanding, absorb what others are doing to at least increase the knowledge base of the ADP practitioners, at least.
Yeah, the AWP, I see that the chunking and structuring has been part of the lean discussion since 1997. I think Glenn Bauer used the term chunking. And that's actually, I think, one of the things where lean thinking might shape AWP. If we chunk the work in terms of things that provide value to the owner and make things by their nature integrated and coordinated, rather than producing very discipline specific type packages, I think that little shift might help us. And so I think that one thing we started is, could we bring some lean thinking to improve AWP? Well, AWP is also going to improve lean thinking because they do such a good job at the constraint removal. Okay, and so as I was at the last LCI Congress and I heard about fake lean, the biggest thing in fake lean that they were talking about was poor constraint removal. They weren't really doing a good job of that. Well, hey, I know some guys who are really good at that. The other thing is we can get all these systems together, but if the people won't work together, they won't work. So we're going to bring in the elements of the lean world to help on who are kind of a little further ahead or a little more focused on human elements. And then we need to understand the physics of flow, because I think we waste an awful lot of time. And then of course, that's maybe the single biggest area where PPI helps us understand that. And of course, the whole how the work is done, the actual operation science of how we actually transform things, we need to understand. So I think all those things work together to go to the next generation.
Yeah.
If James has got some other thoughts that mirror those.
Yeah, again, I think there's the element that's actually common. And one of the things, again, over my 26 years of journey working with lean and some of the AWP concepts, one of the things that I think the PPI specifically actually brings, the PPM specifically brings, is the actual operation science element of it, right? So before, we used to actually, I personally actually used to do things that are actually more, let's say, phrase driven. Our goal is to zero inventory, until I actually learned that inventory, work in process is part of inventory. And if you have zero inventory, you have zero throughput, you have no business, right? So the question is, how much WIP do you actually need in order to meet your demand, at the same time minimize your cash tied up in the system, right? And as we're going to actually talk about this in the future as well, as projects become smaller and actually become more deployment type of project, the concept of inventory actually becomes more and more important, right? And so how do we actually how do we actually apply the next gen project delivery into that concept? You know, I think that's actually one. And then two is actually understanding, now, there is the four elements that we actually talked about. Fernando talked about the production, the procurement packages, but the reason that each of the fabricators actually choose their own batch size is to minimize their setups for their own efficiency, right? And then the transportation actually chooses to actually maximize their utilization of their transportation capacity, right? So how do we actually account for the optimization of individual components at the same time the optimization of a whole is something that I think we actually need a scientific approach to do it. And as Gary alluded to it very early on, we actually have more and more work than we actually have people for, right? So we need to actually figure out how we actually, and as Aris actually also pointed out, that if we're not careful in actually designing these things to begin with, that we're going to actually end up with a lot of rework, right? Which we can't afford to do. So I think this actually scientific approach of how do we make sure that we actually have the right amount of inventory to shield the workers, but not too much that we're actually going against the agile or actually kind of more cash than we actually need in the system.
Yeah, it takes me back to it takes me back to something I've actually learned from James, and Todd. We were setting up for a big workshop with Intel. Spent a lot of time. How would they apply lean thinking to the construction of a fab? And in the conversation, Todd got me to go out and look at the job from the perspective, find all the WIP. And if WIP is all the work that started not done, you walk out there on a typical job, you say, "Oh my God, the amounts of it are absolutely incredible." And our giant bid packages are one of the giant sources of WIP that are just choking us. And they force so many things to be happening so soon. So again, that's just an example of blending perspectives to see something I had never seen before. And I think that we're just beginning.
Right. I totally agree with that, because whatever we practice and the theoretical boundaries of all that, hey, this should all work perfect, but you go out there, and if it's been in all three, you go out and look at AWP, and for instance, and you see, well, hey, these guys say they do it, but they really aren't, but they need help support over here.
Mhm.
And when you raise these conversations levels up and helping people to not only see what they know, but see what others know, because hey, we all know what we know, right? And there's the whole concept of we know things that we don't know, so we bring in experts to go do that. But it's the danger zone is that what we don't know that we don't know, right? And in AWP, there's a lot of folks that don't know about what operation science, what other lean practices need to bring in. And now the conversations turn from, hey, maybe we can benefit from target value delivery. Hey, we can benefit from last planner. Hey, what is this flow thing? What's operation science? So the conversations are happening, which is over the past 2 years, and John and I are the co-chairs of the AWP Plus Lean, so anybody can join it. We didn't have that conversation 2 years ago. It was mine or theirs, and that doesn't work, this doesn't work. It's just the way it was. There was, on the AWP side, I had to fight that all the time. So the fact is, these conversations and what each is contributing to is making everybody aware that there are certain things out there that we need to take advantage of, especially what James alluded to, the fact that, hey, the world and all the projects coming at us and the demand for higher delivery standards than what we've had, we have to think differently. We have to think outside the box, and we have to blend all these methodologies if we're really going to deliver something of value to this industry.
The other thing we have is each of these organizations kind of has a different audience and a different level of influence. And one of the attractive parts from the lean LCI perspective, hey, this blending in with AWP gives us an audience with a huge group of customers that don't know about us yet. And I think all the organizations can say the same thing. And so there's a huge number of people who are really like the idea of AWP, who are either adverse to lean or not very familiar with it. So this is also a way that we're blending and just increasing the knowledge base and exposing it to a lot more people in the industry, so we can have the better chance of getting to that tipping point.
Well, I'm excited about working with you all to paint this picture of how these things work together and complement each other and tackle that common enemy. And that's really exciting work we've got ahead of us here in the rest of this year and next. But let's talk about, in the meantime, what do you recommend projects go do?
Well, the question is what projects go do versus what the organization or the manager of those projects go do. Because projects, first of all, they have to develop their own execution plan, and they should, as they develop those execution plans, they should be looking at, hey, what are my organization policies? What is the particular details or conditions that this particular project has? Is it a big project, a small project? What blend of things can really help me optimize the delivery of this program? So there's multiple layers. I mean, yeah, the project should be the ultimate beneficiary, and whoever's going to design the strategy for delivering that program or the project execution plan, the technologies to be used on that, if they consider what has been already proven with other methodologies and other technologies and other culture building, education and training components, that should be going into a project execution plan. And the feasibility of that, obviously needs to be studied. But if we don't open up the whole box and look at what I can bring in, we're not really ever going to optimize. We're just going to get some better results, but not optimize.
Maybe you start thinking in simplicity, how does work really get done? How does the work I'm going to go do affect the next person? And how do I make their work go a little easier? How do I give them exactly what they need, exactly when they need it, exactly how they want it? And you start building this awareness, which is part of the thing. And pretty soon you're going to start understanding that will lead you in. I think that discussion would lead you into most everything we're talking about. That's how a lot of the lean construction evolved. Is we wanted to have a week's worth of work that didn't change. Well, pretty soon we had to do a lot better job of look ahead planning and constraint management. And we'll do, but that'd be a lot easier if our organizations weren't so siloed. So we came up with IPD. And I think the other organizations, Fernando talked about something different. They started with one goal that they've been evolving. Well, let's evolve together. But just what you want to go do, just start seeing how the whole system works at an even very simple level, let alone the way is what James would have us learn to go do.
Yeah. So James, your perspective.
Yeah, I think number one, it's not actually about, this approach versus that approach versus the, whatever the other approach that you actually have, including the approach that your company might be doing already. I think it's, we actually talked about in our paper the three eras, right? So the old days, we actually used to focus all on productivity. There was the era of productivity, and then the second era actually came in, which is the era of predictability. And I think that the emphasis actually in the future actually needs to be, as we talked about, it's era of profitability. So everybody that's actually involved in the delivery process should be able to be profitable while delivering the valuable built environment that we actually so need, as per your opening statement. So one of the things is when we are actually thinking about, what do we actually go deploy or implement, I think you need to actually look at it from a perspective of, does this actually achieve the target goal of actually providing a reliable or a profitable project to the organization? And actually say, don't actually just singly say, I'm just going to do lean and actually ignore the other two, but learn about those things, not actually as you hear from others, but maybe actually from whether it's actually what it's intended to be, and actually learn and actually and follow the development of this joint working group. Right now, Gary and I actually have been involved in the weekly meetings to actually get this thing so that we can actually get more and more involved. And I think there will be some outputs coming out of there. I think people should actually pay attention to, but at the same time, learn about these approaches as it's intended, and actually understand its, let's say, gray areas that other parts actually may feel like Fernando just actually talked about, the flow concept and the inventory and the variability. These are things that other approaches actually the operational science actually may bring for clarity of some gray areas as well. So I think you should pay attention to all three and learn at this point until there is one joint body of knowledge that has merged all three approaches.
Yeah,
Or maybe fourth approach that we actually identify along the way.
Well, one last very quick one based on James, all three. You talked about, learn Boy Scouts, what do you need for a fire? What's more important, the source of ignition, the fuel, or the oxygen? Well, you need all three of these things working together to optimize combustion. And so I think we kind of look at that as drawing, it makes little sense for each of us to advance more and more oxygen if we aren't looking at the system.
Very well put. As you guys can imagine, you lit up the question board. Hopefully, a good share of these questions were addressed in the conversation. But I just want to tackle. We had just a couple of minutes here, but we will get back to folks who ask the questions offline.
Yeah, I'll type some answers in there for sure.
So a key question, I think, what are the cultural and organizational issues and barriers to blending of these ideas?
I see, except the first one to be your first.
Yeah, I see a couple of challenges myself, and just because we had to deal with it, and we started up a whole research team on just the culture of adopting advanced work packaging, right? And I'm sure the similar problems with lean and others is how do we get people to start thinking about from a culture perspective how to adopt these different methodologies. And a part of it is raising awareness and showing the benefits and getting the leadership involved, to also support this, because if we don't have leadership and we're not really going to get very far, we'll get some, we'll get a little bit of frustration, but we'll get some minor benefits, but not the level that people are asking about, which has been determined the step change, right? Everybody's looking for that step change, and you can't do it by incremental delivery programs or lukewarm leadership. So
Then you have to understand that I think the nature of competition is a huge. I think we have this paradigm for how we drive the best competition, and the irony is the bidding process we used to drive competition guarantees the project will be inefficient. And so that as a system, and so understanding the competition and collaboration aren't mutually exclusive. We can actually enhance the competition by making projects more attractive.
Yeah,
and less
that's a
risky.
really good point. James, any final thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there's actually the culture and implementation is very important, but I actually have a little bit of different mental model that stem from what we all actually went through. So remember the adoption of mobile phones. We did not actually have the industry and the humanity actually change its mindset first before we actually started using the mobile phones. Right? The organizational structure, how we do work, how we live in a daily basis actually was structured by the adoption of mobile phones individually, and the groundswell actually set the foundation on what we actually do today. I think the digitalization and the tools that we're actually going to put in the hands of the engineers, the fabricators, the people that do transportation, the installation actually has a huge role to play. So the question is, how do we actually make those digital tools not actually just automate what we're actually doing today faster and create mistakes faster, but how do we actually make those to become more aligned with the direction of the next gen project delivery, so that we can actually have the cultures come as a more of a groundswell rather than let's get everyone to change their mind before we actually go change something. Right. So I think there is actually, again, as I said, the digitalization and the tools have a huge role to play.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And unfortunately, I think we're going to have to call time here. Again, we'll get back to those of you who asked questions that we didn't answer. And we're going to move this into the next segment, which is actually my absolutely favorite time of the symposium. And James is going to introduce it. So thanks, Fernando and John. We really appreciate you sharing freely of your wisdom and your advice, and look forward to working with you in the coming year.
all right, thank you so much.